When my son got married, I hid the fact that I had inherited a $7 million estate from my late husband. Thank God I kept quiet. A couple of days after the wedding, my daughter-in-law came with a notary. I will never forget what she said. Before we continue, please tell us what country you are from and how old you are. We would love to get to know our audience. Enjoy listening. They say that weddings bring families closer together. Generations gather around the same table, reminisce about the good times, laugh, and hug each other. That such days become a starting point for something new and bright. But as it turns out, sometimes weddings just quietly, almost imperceptibly, show how far apart you have already grown. I had been preparing for this day for a long time. I had kept the dress, the pink one with soft folds at the waist, for many years. I took it out and ironed it. I carefully hung it on a hanger 2 days before the trip. I baked banana bread. The recipe was old, almost from memory. The same one that Michael used to love. Back when he was a schoolboy. When he came home from the cold, with a red nose, and said, "Mom, it smells like when I was a kid," I even stroked my favorite cardigan. The one with the little pearl buttons. Michael used to laugh that in it I looked like a mother from old American TV shows. I stood in front of the mirror, fixing my hair, choosing lipstick, subtle, neat, all in the hope that, maybe, just maybe, on this day we would become at least a little bit closer. But as soon as I entered the hall, as soon as I looked at the seating arrangement, as soon as I realized that no one had even thought to save a seat for me, at least somewhere near him, something inside me clicked, quietly but very noticeably. It clicked so hard that even then, at that very moment, I knew that this would be the moment that would change everything. Spring in upstate New York is always special. Quiet. But it's not the kind of quiet that brings peace. It's a different kind, the kind where you feel like you're slowly being forgotten. My house is right on the lake. Pine trees all around, an old boat on the shore, long since out of commission. And many, too many memories. I live alone. Richard left 4 years ago, and since then the house seems to have become bigger, colder, emptier. Michael calls less and less often. He visits less and less often. I'm not angry. I understand that young people have their own lives, their own concerns, their own plans. Maybe that's how it should be. Isn't that why we raise them? My days have become the same. In the morning, I bake banana bread, open the kitchen window, drink slightly warm coffee, read the local newspaper, and then go water the tulips by the porch. The very ones that stubbornly refuse to bloom on time, year after year. It's as if they are as stubborn as I am. Sometimes I stand at the window and watch the mail truck drive by, without stopping. And I think, maybe it will stop a little further down the road. Maybe there, around the corner, someone else, just like me, goes out on the porch every day, pretending to just be getting some fresh air, but really waiting too. 3 weeks ago, Michael called. His voice was cheerful but somehow distant. It was as if he wasn't talking to me, but to someone on his work phone. "Mom, I'm getting married." I sat down on the edge of my chair. He sounded happy but somehow detached. It was as if his thoughts were already somewhere else. "What's her name?" "Jessica," he replied. And then he immediately changed the subject. I asked what kind of wedding they were planning. He said something simple but elegant. Then he fell silent. He didn't ask when I would be free on the weekend. He didn't ask if I could come. He didn't offer to help with the preparations. He didn't say a word about my opinion. I suggested that I could bake an apple pie for the rehearsal dinner. Like before. He laughed a little, politely, dryly. "That's sweet, Mom." And that was it. He hung up. And I sat there for a long time with the phone in my hands, just staring at it, as if I could see some kind of answer on the screen. At that moment, I felt something that I was afraid to admit even to myself. It was as if I had just been given the role of a guest in a life where I had always thought I was one of the main characters. But I chose to hold on to hope. I chose a dress, wiped the steps on the porch, even neatly hemmed the sleeves of my coat, because inside me there was still a foolish, stubborn, but genuine belief that maybe this wedding would bring us back together, even if only for a moment. Sometimes the greatest losses don't happen in a single day, accompanied by screams or slamming doors. Sometimes they come in silence. In small, seemingly harmless excuses, in short, polite conversations, in unspoken words that hurt like 1,000 tiny cuts. It is the silence that lies down with you in bed, falls asleep next to you, and makes you whisper to yourself, "At what point did I become more than unnecessary?" The wedding took place at a country hotel, where Richard and I had stayed a couple of times in the summer. 2 hours drive south, on the shore of a lake, with wooden beams under the ceiling, glass walls, and that very view of the water that I used to think always symbolized something good. Michael once mentioned that it was Marina's idea. She wanted something modern, but with a touch of classicism, he said. I arrived early, as always. An old habit to be the first to arrive. So as not to be late. So as not to be superfluous. I got out of the car and smoothed the hem of my pink dress. The very one I had kept for almost 10 years. Soft folds at the waist, a slightly muted shade, nothing flashy. My hair was neatly pinned back, a touch of lipstick, minimal jewelry. How should a mother look at her son's wedding? A girl from the reception desk met me in the lobby. Young, with perfect hair, smiling as if I were just another guest on the list. She handed me a badge. A small plastic rectangle with a white background. It said Margaret Johnson. No mom. No ribbons or pins like the bride's relatives had. I held it in my hands, probably a couple of seconds longer than necessary. Then I pinned it to my dress. Guests were already gathering in the main hall. People stood in groups, laughing, talking loudly, taking pictures. Soft music was playing. Waiters were rushing around with trays, champagne, some snacks and miniature spoons, everything as it should be for such events. I noticed Michael. He was standing by the window, surrounded by people I didn't know. Jessica was holding his hand, laughing loudly. He didn't see me, and it seemed he wasn't even looking for me. I stood there, not knowing whether to approach him, wait, or look around. A young man with an earpiece approached me. He was clearly one of the organizers. Politely but quickly, he pointed to a table in the far corner of the room, near a column, almost against the wall. I glanced at the other tables. The groom's colleagues, the bride's distant relatives, the bride's friends' parents. Everything was neatly labeled. My card was simple, Margaret. No last name. No role. No indication of who I was. I sat down between two complete strangers. To my left was a man in his 50s. He was talking about insurance for country houses. On my right was a woman who, as it turned out, bred alpacas somewhere near Vermont. Both were polite, but completely uninterested in me. They talked to each other, over my head, as if I were an empty chair. When the toasts began, the microphone was passed from hand to hand. Marina's father, then her brother, then a friend from university. Jokes about parties, student days, summer camps, and first glasses of tequila. At one point, someone asked loudly, "When is the groom's mother going to say something?" Jessica laughed and waved her hand. "Oh, maybe later," and switched to another topic. Dinner passed as if it hadn't happened. I was served chicken, so dry that even a knife had trouble cutting it. An untouched buttered bread roll remained on the edge of my plate. Almost no one at my table finished their portion. The dessert looked like a picture from the cover of a magazine. A beautiful lemon tart with an elegant drop of cream. I took one bite and instead of sweetness, I felt only bitterness. Michael never came to me, not for a minute, not for a second. He danced with Marina, with her mother, with some aunt I didn't even know. I sat there, adjusting the hem of my dress, fixing the clasp on my cardigan 3 times, just to keep my hands busy. I smiled twice at the photographer who walked by without even raising his camera. When the evening came to an end, I remained in the same place, in the same chair. The hall was almost empty, with empty plates and crumpled napkins. People were gathering their bags and heading out to their cars. I neatly folded my napkin, tucked it under the rim of my glass, slowly got up, and left. No one called out to me. No one noticed. And as I walked toward the exit, the first thing I thought was, just like that, without words, entire chapters of life come to an end. A week passed after the wedding before Michael called. I was washing dishes, my hands covered in suds. The phone vibrated on the windowsill. I dried my hands and the towel looked at the screen, my son's name. Something fluttered in my chest. For a second, it felt like everything could go back to the way it was. I pressed answer. His voice was cheerful, but somehow unnaturally even. As if he had rehearsed this conversation in advance. "Hi, Mom. Want to come over for dinner? Just you and me." He immediately added that Jessica would be with her friends, so no outsiders. I didn't ask a single question. I just said, "Of course." I hung up and stood there for a long time, looking out the window, not knowing whether to be happy or prepare for another quiet disappointment. That evening, I decided to wear a cardigan. The one with the little pearl buttons. The one I wore when I first held Michael in my arms after he came home from the hospital. It still fit me, warm and soft, as if it had preserved the scent of those years. I baked oatmeal cookies and wrapped them in foil, a habit I had kept from the days when he was a schoolboy. The road was quiet. The asphalt was dry, the sky was gray. That same gray spring sky when it's supposed to be March, but winter is still in the air. I drove up to his new house. A beautiful brick facade, perfectly trimmed bushes, 2 identical lamps at the front door, and, of course, a camera above the doorbell. Michael greeted me with a smile. A brief, perfunctory one. He hugged me as if we were neighbors who had bumped into each other at the store. "Come in, the kitchen is across the hall," he said. I walked in and stopped. There were 2 empty plates on the table, an open bottle of wine, and a neat stack of papers. On top was a blue ballpoint pen, placed diagonally. There was no smell of food. There was no sound of a stove cooking, no smell of frying, not even a hint that dinner was planned at all. Michael poured me a glass of wine. He praised the cookies and asked about my trip. He spoke in an overly polite manner, as if he were at a job interview. Then he took one of the folders and, lowering his voice slightly, said, "Mom, it's just for peace of mind. Well, just in case something happens. You understand, time is passing. No one is getting any younger." He spoke as if he were talking about the weather. Evenly, calmly, without emotion. I took the first page. And even before I finished reading it, I already understood. Power of attorney, full access to my accounts, management of real estate, the right to sign on my behalf, without time limits, without conditions. Without the possibility of revocation. There was no mention of son or family. There was agent, powers, control. He smiled gently. "Of course, you don't have to rush. Just think about it." The pen was already unscrewed. The cap was off. It was lying nearby, ready. I looked at the empty plates. At the turned-off stove. I realized that this was not dinner. It was a meeting with a single purpose. I said I would take the documents with me. I would study them carefully at home. He nodded. Once. Quickly. We talked about trivial things for another 15 minutes. About the neighbors. About some TV program. When I got up, he hugged me again. lightly, as if out of politeness. In the car, I didn't start the engine for a long time. I just sat there, hands on my knees. The bag of cookies remained untouched on the passenger seat. A minute later, the motion sensor on his porch went off, the light flashed, then went out again. Like everything else, it was automatic. At home, I didn't even take off my coat. I sat on the edge of the sofa, half the zipper undone, my hands lying as if they belonged to someone else. The house was too quiet. Even the old clock in the kitchen seemed to have stopped ticking for a second. I sat there for a long time. Then I got up and went to the basement. It was cold in the basement. The kind of cold that seeps through old boards, through concrete floors, as if it had been stuck there since last year. I walked slowly. My knees hurt on the way down, my fingers were freezing as I held onto the railing. In the far corner, behind the washing machine, stood an old, low cabinet. Richard had made it himself once, from the remains of a kitchen set. At the time, he joked that if anything happened, you would always find what you needed here. I had never looked in there before. I bent down and carefully pulled a heavy box from under the bottom shelf. Dust, the dry smell of wood, and something very familiar. The lid creaked when I opened it. Everything was just as I would have expected from Richard. Neatly arranged. In folders. With dividers. Labeled. At the very bottom was a thick envelope with my name on it in his handwriting. My breath caught in my throat. I unfolded the sheet of paper. The letter was short. Just a few lines. I know you won't ask for help, even if it gets tough. That's why everything has been arranged so that you won't be left alone. Don't let anyone make decisions for you. Especially when it comes to money. And don't tell Michael. Not because I don't love him, but because I know how the world works. Money changes people, and sometimes it just shows what they've been all along. I read it over and over again. No tears came. There were almost no emotions either. There was only a heavy, tangible understanding. I took the rest of the folders. There were accounts, deposits, investments. Which I didn't even know about. Stocks. Funds. A contract for a small house in the state of Ohio that Richard had once bought and never mentioned. The amount on the general page made me reread it 3 times. More than $7 million. I sat on the floor for a long time, with these papers on my lap, the icy floor beneath me. Not joy. Not relief, something much heavier. As if Richard had put up a wall between me and the rest of the world one last time, so that I would not be left defenseless. I closed the box, locked it, and stood up slowly, my knees trembling from the cold. Upstairs, I turned off all the lights except for the lamp in the kitchen. I sat down at the table. I placed a blank sheet of paper in front of me and those very documents from Michael. I picked up a pen and began to write not what he expected, not what would be convenient, but what was truly my decision. For 3 days, I hardly left the house. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed the silence to mean something. I didn't want my next decision to be made on emotion. I didn't want it to reek of resentment or anger. I needed it to come from within. From understanding. Because it is understanding, it is awareness, that helps when people want to make you convenient. I searched for the right number for a long time. On the back of an old greeting card, I found Carolina's phone number. She used to be one of the best lawyers for inheritance and trust matters. Now, retired, she lives alone in a house on the outskirts. We hadn't spoken for many years. Not since her husband died. But I suddenly remembered how, once, over a cup of tea, she told me that quiet women leave the most noticeable traces. Just not right away. I dialed her number. She answered right away. Her voice was older but firm. I started to tell her what was going on. She was silent. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. When I finished, she said only one word, tomorrow. At my place. No unnecessary words. Just coffee and putting my papers in order. We sat in her kitchen. A small room, shelves full of books, an embroidered napkin on the wall. Cups, different but clean. I laid everything out in front of her. The envelope with Richard's letter, the folders with his attachments, and the very papers that Michael had brought me. Caroline put on her glasses and began to read. Carefully. Page by page. Quickly, slowly, like someone who knows how many fates she has already seen. Too late. When she finished, she looked up. You have more power than you think, she said calmly. She explained that the money was protected. The investments were reliable. The legal basis was solid. But only if I keep it in my own hands. Then she asked if I wanted to set up a trust. I answered without hesitation, yes. Who will you put in it? I smiled slightly, no one. Not yet. Maybe never. She nodded. Without surprise. Then Caroline took the papers Michael had left me. She leafed through them. Her face didn't even flinch. Tough option, she said quietly. Immediate effect, full control, no right of revocation, no third parties, no supervision, no expiry date. She put the papers back on the table. These are not papers about care. These are papers about dispossession. We finalized everything. Caroline prepared the documents for the creation of the trust. She transferred all the assets into it. She made me the sole beneficiary and administrator. She added a medical clause. No changes. No transfers of authority. Without the conclusion of 2 independent doctors about my complete incapacity. Then she handed me a pen. I signed. Slowly. Thoughtfully. Each letter like a line, like a boundary between me and all the intentions of strangers. Caroline put all the documents in a thick folder. Keep it where you can get it quickly, but out of sight. I put the folder under the sink, behind the box of dishwasher tablets. When I was driving home, the air was different, not lighter, but cleaner, clearer, as if for the first time in a long time. I saw my life as it was, without illusions, without rose-colored glasses, without naivety. And most importantly, I no longer felt like a woman who had been left behind. I felt like a woman with backbone and choices. Michael's message came 2 days later. Mom, let's try to be human. Dinner, no papers. Just talk. I stared at the screen for a long time, then closed my phone and didn't go back to it that day. The next morning, I replied briefly, okay. I didn't say I was coming, not at all. Caroline parked a block away from his house. We agreed in advance that she would stay in the car and wait. Just in case, I wasn't worried, I wasn't angry, I didn't even feel hurt. I just knew exactly why I was going there and what I couldn't allow anymore. Michael met me at the door with that same expression I knew so well. A soft smile, slightly narrowed eyes, as if he had become that boy again who used to run around the house barefoot as a child. The kitchen smelled of garlic and baked vegetables, and there was even bread on the table. Everything looked like a real dinner. But something inside told me it wasn't about food. We sat down at the table. At first, we had the usual conversation. About books. About the weather. About a TV series I hadn't even seen. I answered his questions calmly and reservedly. Michael kept glancing at the dresser. There was another neat stack of papers there. Stapled. Labeled with stickers. With a pen already taken out of the case. When he finally spoke about them, he was different, quieter, more measured, as if he had rehearsed every word in advance. I talked to a lawyer. He advises a lighter option, without obligations, just a preliminary agreement, so that, well, it would be calmer and more convenient for everyone. He gently pushed the folder toward me. I didn't touch it. Instead, I silently took out my document, formally folded in half, and placed it on top of his paper. Michael froze. For a couple of seconds. Then he unfolded the sheet. He read it to the end. It was an official notice of the creation of a trust, with my signature at the bottom, with a seal, with legal wording that left zero chance for manipulation. All my assets were now under my complete control. No one could access them without my direct consent. At first, his face didn't change, but his eyes began to blink more frequently. His jaw tensed slightly, like a person who is about to choke but is keeping a straight face. I looked at him calmly. Michael, I appreciate your concern. I understand that you are worried that life is unpredictable, but everything is already taken care of. And finally, he asked, did you consult with anyone? I replied, yes, with someone who understands what it means to be ready, but without pressure. There was a pause in the room. He leaned back in his chair, tapped his fingers on the table twice, then froze. At that moment, he ceased to be my son and became just a man who realized that all his attempts had ended. At that very moment, Caroline entered the room, calmly, without haste, with a short, polite smile. Hello, Michael, she said. I'm Caroline, your mother's friend. Her voice was quiet, but it had that confidence that comes from those who have seen other people's mistakes too often, too late. We took my things, thanked him for dinner, and left. I didn't even look back. It was cool outside. The wind was blowing the first dry leaves along the sidewalk. I exhaled, deeply, calmly. And for the first time in a long time, I was leaving without feeling pain or bitterness. I was leaving with confidence, with that feeling when everything inside has fallen into place. The next morning was colder than I expected. It was a piercing cold that crept under the floors, into the cracks between the window frames, into every crevice of the old house. I made myself some toast, poured orange juice into a glass, and sat down at the table. I didn't touch either of them. My hands were still warm from the previous evening. But inside, it was as if something had finally closed. Around 10 o'clock, my phone vibrated. A message from Michael. You only made things worse. For nothing. No mom. No hello. No explanation. No human tone whatsoever. I stared at the screen for a long time, then turned the phone face down. The toast had gone cold. The juice had gone cloudy. The second message never came. And I understood, with that very feminine, quiet, silent certainty, that these words were not about disappointment or sadness, but about control. About that very door that he thought was always ajar. And now, for the first time, it had slammed shut. After lunch, I went into the garage. I decided to sort through some old boxes. I found some photo albums. I sat down right on the concrete floor and leafed through the pages. In one, Michael, small, with rosy cheeks, with a new toy truck, is smiling so that even through the photo you can see he is a happy child. I always kept this image of him in my mind. When I was afraid, when I was tired, when I didn't know what to do. It was my support, my anchor, but now I looked at that photo and for the first time saw not only the boy. I saw a child who was used to having his wishes fulfilled without questions, without conditions, without explanations, because Richard and I raised him that way. We gave him too much, too often, too unconditionally. We thought that was the right thing to do. That was love. Towards evening, another message arrived. This time, it was from Marina. Polite, even-tempered. I'm sorry that everything turned out so tense. We were just trying to plan everything responsibly. If you ever want to talk, I'm always open to communication. And at the end, the phrase that stayed in my head the longest. You have raised a strong son. We just wanted to support his future. I reread it twice. The words were polished, impeccably calibrated. But beneath the politeness, I heard what they were really trying to say. You've done your part. Now let him go. I didn't respond. I just closed the phone and left it on the edge of the kitchen table. In the evening, I poured the cold juice into the sink. Not because I was angry. I just didn't want to drink something that had long since lost its taste. I went to the window and stared into the darkness for a long time. The first real spring fog was already settling outside. The kind that spreads across the ground and seems to hide everything unnecessary. I didn't cry. I didn't pace around the room. I just stood there. Because sometimes the loudest answer is simply silence. And sometimes when the door is closed, it's not worth opening it again. Not out of pity. Not out of fear, and certainly not because of family ties. The house had always been quiet, even when Richard was alive. But now, after my last conversation with Michael, that silence had changed. It was no longer neutral. Not cozy, but final. Like a verdict. I began to move around the house more slowly. Not because I was tired, but because there was no longer any reason to rush. Every morning I wiped down the countertops. Even if they were clean, I folded the towels into perfectly even stacks. I watered the flowers at the same time every day. I no longer waited for phone calls. But still, every day, I noticed that they weren't coming. 3 days later, the light on the answering machine flashed. I didn't pick up the phone when he called, but I listened to the message. Michael's voice sounded as if it were coming from somewhere behind a closed door. He said he had been too hasty. That he just wanted everything to be done properly. Then, more quietly, he said he missed the way things used to be, that he just wanted to talk. I didn't delete the message, but I didn't save it either. It stayed there, in a folder between spam and notifications from the bank. That evening, I accidentally opened old messages on my phone. I scrolled through them aimlessly. Photos of him grilling meat at the dacha, of Jessica holding the apple pie we once baked together. The dog, long since dead, sitting on the stairs. Further on, his old messages. There were emojis, exclamation marks, phrases like "I love you." I opened one of them, just to look, without pain, without tears, just acknowledging the fact, and then I started deleting them, one by one, not out of resentment, but as an act of acceptance. It was. And it passed. The only thing I left was an old video. Michael, 10 years old. With a flashlight under his chin, he tells a scary story. And somewhere off camera, I laugh. With a young, light, old voice. I watched it twice. Then I closed my phone. At the end of February, I moved. Not far away, still by the lake, but the house was smaller, older, with crooked shutters and a mailbox that leaned to one side. But it felt right, as if it had been waiting just for me. I took only the essentials with me. A photo of Richard, yellowed recipe cards, 2 boxes of books, a worn blue coffee pot, and a ceramic owl that never scared anyone, but still stood on the porch. In the mornings, I started going to the local library. Not because I needed books, but because it was simply pleasant to hear someone turning the pages. Sometimes I helped out at the reception desk. Unofficially. Just to keep my hands busy. That's where I met them. Other women. Those who came here too, every day. They weren't noisy. They didn't wear matching coats. They didn't talk in hushed tones at the counter. They just showed up. They stayed longer than necessary. One read. Another wrote. The third just sat by the window, looking out at the street. As if waiting for something that had already passed. There was Susan, who once ran a diner. Now she was sewing a quilt out of her husband's shirts. There was Linda, who brought a thermos of mint tea with her, marked with her late sister's initials. There was Patricia, with a cane that she only took out at the front door. We didn't become friends on the first day. But with each passing week, something like understanding developed between us. A shared silence. Shared glances, shared brief nods. Once, Patricia came up to me and said, "Would you like to help with the flower bed behind the library?" I replied, yes, without hesitation. The soil there was hard, dry, and compacted, like anything that has been neglected for too long. But we picked up our shovels. Knees in the mud. Hands in the dirt. No talking. No explanations. We planted tomatoes, basil, and a couple of sunflowers, just to show that someone was here. We called this place the Quiet Corner. We rarely talked about our children, and when we did, it was briefly, without resentment, without unnecessary details. Just like people who know that scars are not always on the outside. What connected us was not sadness, but clarity, the understanding that sometimes the most important thing is not to wait, not to hope, not to ask, but simply to live, right now. Here, in this moment. And as I stood there, with dirt under my fingernails, books behind me, and the sun on my face, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a burden. I felt like a woman, not lost, not useless, but simply real, alive, and in my place. Thank you for listening to this story to the end. Friends, if there are any mistakes in the story or anything that is unclear, please write about it in the comments. I will definitely take your comments into account and do better next time. If you liked the story, please write in the comments, like it, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much for watching.